So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce our seminar session now. And with our seminar sessions, this involves audience participation. So we will have 2 talks followed by live question and answer. So please don't forget to submit any thoughts, comments and questions through our online portal. And again, as I mentioned earlier, for social media, please use hashtag CHT2023. So our first seminar presentation is from Dr. Clare Lancaster. Clare is a regulatory expert in residence at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. Clare is giving us an overview of regulatory requirements for medical technologies. Thank you, Clare.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Clare Lankester, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak for a few minutes on a topic which always raises lots of discussion and questions, and that's to give an overview of the regulation of medical technologies. My background is in science, so my PhD is in biochemistry from Leeds, and I've worked on the development of medical technologies in various forms for the last 15 years. I'm currently a visiting academic at the University of Sheffield, where I work with academic teams to plan regulatory strategy and provide training on various topics. So why regulate? I always think a good place to start on this topic is to think about the why. Why do we need to regulate medical technologies? And I think the simple answer really is that if we don't, then bad things happen. So as an example, medical device regulation in the UK and the EU in the early 2000s was under heavy scrutiny due to a series of patient safety scandals you probably remember. There was issues with breast implants, pelvic meshes and hip implants that were making headline news. Essentially, the problem was that the advances in technologies, so in devices or materials and softwares, had outpaced the regulation, and the regulatory framework that was in place was unable to handle either the volume and also the complexity of the devices coming onto the market. So the result of this was that patient safety suffered, and there was quite a negative view of the industry in the press. So the EU's response to this was to bring out a new regulation, which is probably familiar to most of you, known as the MDR. And the aim of that was to very much raise the bar for almost all types of devices, both in terms of patient safety and also in terms of the way that they're regulated, and to take that out of commercial control. So it's fair to say that regulation varies across the world. Different territories have different responsible bodies. The EU, as I've just said, has its new MDR, but post-Brexit, Great Britain still has its own older regulatory system, which is run by the MHRA. For medical devices and related technologies like software and AI, there is a significant change programme underway at the MHRA, with the aim of upscaling our existing regulation to something similar to the MDR. So there was a public consultation in 2021, and the government published its response to that, which gives an idea of the plans. I think the general feeling is they're not too far away from what the EU has already implemented, but we're still waiting on the final publication to see exactly what will happen. In the US, the FDA looks after all of this. And I think essentially to get a device or most medical technologies to market, you have 2 things that you need to do. One, you need a quality management system in place within the company to evidence to the regulators that you can make the devices in a controlled and safe manner. And then each device that company makes need a very detailed technical file to detail everything about it and all the way it's being investigated, and essentially conclude that it's safe for patients and users. So what all of those systems have in common is that is the key aim. The common aim is to ensure that patients are only exposed to technologies which are of benefit to them. So in regulatory language, this means that the expected clinical benefit of using the technology outweighs the likely risks. And this is really the linchpin of all regulation in the sector. To bring a technology to the market, both sides of this seesaw have to be thoroughly explored, tested, documented. And then the conclusions made by the manufacturer are independently inspected by the regulators to ensure that they're correct and scientifically valid. And as a general rule, higher risk technologies, which are used potentially in higher risk areas of medicine, attract greater regulatory scrutiny. So what types of technologies are regulated? This slide shows some of the categories within medical device legislation as an example. So to qualify as a medical device per se, the product needs to have a specific medical purpose for a human being. This can include various specifics around diagnosis, treatment, prevention, or monitoring of a condition. The exact wording of these definitions is within the legal text. Medical devices must have a primary mode of action which is not pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic. And that's a key definition because that's what sets them apart from drug products. A huge number of products qualify as medical devices, anything from simple wound dressings to implantable stents or catheters. There's really thousands of products that fall within the definition of a medical device. And then once you've qualified as a device, there are a series of classification rules which essentially give a higher class to higher risk devices and a lower class to lower risk devices. Software can also be regulated as a medical device if it has that medical purpose. If software doesn't have a medical purpose, then it's not a medical device. It might be subject to other legislation, but it doesn't fall within, it doesn't need to meet the requirements of the medical device legislation. Software can be a device on its own, like an app for diagnosing a particular clinical condition, or it could be part of a device that has both hardware and software components. AI and machine learning devices also fall within this group, and there's a lot of work going on right now to ensure at a government level that the regulation of AI-enabled devices is appropriate, that it's proportionate, and also that it's capable of keeping up with the field. And there's a lot of work going on with focus groups and government departments right now to make sure that as and when we have an AI-specific regulation, it stands the test of time. In vitro diagnostics are a further subset of devices. They're defined as tests or kits which utilise specimens from the human body but don't take their inputs from the body itself. So that's things like blood or tissue analysis. And software can also be classed as an IVD if its medical purpose is to analyse samples from the body rather than to look at the body itself. So where do you start? We definitely can't cover most of this in 10 or 15 minutes. The regulatory world has its own special language. It has a ridiculous number of acronyms, and it can be really difficult to know what is relevant and where to begin. There's lots of information available online. If you could find a couple of regulatory consultants or consulting companies which are relevant to your field on LinkedIn or Twitter, many of them have blogs or they post updates about what's going on in the sector, which are often really helpful. The UK government also has a series of web pages which do describe how products are regulated, and there's lots of guidance documents on there as well. So, for example, there's guidance documents about how to submit for permission to run a clinical investigation, or what information you need to include on your product label, very specific guidance documents on all kinds of specific topics. And the government web pages are also where updates to changes in the regulations are published as well. So it can be really helpful to keep an eye on those, particularly if you're in like the software or the AI type field where everything is changing so rapidly. There are also ISO standards which you can read, and I know Emma from BSI is going to talk about those in more detail shortly. They are designed to help you with understanding how to meet the regulations, as in what you actually need to do to prove to the authorities that you've done the right thing. The legal text often says what you have to do, whereas the guidance documents and the standards can help you understand the how and give some practical advice on what to do. However, I think for those of you who are researching or looking to develop a new technology, this is where I would actually suggest that you start. So imagine what the end product that you're working on is going to look like. Imagine what it needs to look like to be successful. If you can describe it, draw it, think about who is going to use it and when, then answering questions like these will actually go a long way towards helping you understand what you need to do next. So, for example, right at the beginning, how does it work? What is its purpose? What's its primary mode of action? By answering that question, that will tell you if it's a medical device or if it's an in vitro diagnostic or if it's something else. And only by answering those really key questions can you start to narrow down as to which regulatory path you're going to find yourself on. So for another example, what's the expected clinical benefit? Who's going to benefit and how are they going to benefit clinically? And that will tell you what you need to measure in your clinical trial. And the who is it used on question will tell you who needs to be in your clinical trial. That's particularly relevant to devices aimed at children, obviously, because if they're aimed at children specifically, at some stage there will be a need to prove that they work in a clinical trial population, including children. If you can think about how is it different to what's already available, this might tell you what you need to measure in the trials, or it might tell you what sort of controls to use. So if you can mind map out the way the product will be used, what the point of it is, then you'll find looking at the regulatory requirements so much easier. And it also starts to make some of the language a bit clearer as well. So to take the language point, when you describe what the device does and the situation where it should be used, in regulatory speak, you're beginning to describe its intended purpose. So the intended purpose is a specific piece of information you need to know. But answering these kind of questions will help you start to build up that information. Also, when you start to consider how the device might go wrong and what would happen if it did, you're prompting yourself to consider the safety of the users and the patients from the very beginning. And in regulatory language, that means you've essentially got the start of your risk analysis and a risk management plan. So this is my recommendation. Answering questions like this will go a long way towards helping you understand what to do next. If the device is intended for use in children by parents at home, then that has implications for the kind of clinical trial you would need to run and the nature of any training or user manuals that you need to provide. As a rule, devices for use by lay people have a greater need for very specific accompanying documents and trainings. I think it's also key to say that although the regulations cover all kinds of devices, and they have to, so they're very generic, there is the expectation that the way you meet them is very personal and very appropriate to that specific product. So for anyone working on developing new technologies, this is where I would suggest you start. Essentially, you are developing a target product profile, which you can document and keep up to date as the project goes on. It's also useful to look back and review these kind of questions regularly to make sure you're not unintentionally moving away from what you had originally planned and what you know from your other research is what the market needs. I hope that was a useful, quick introduction to the topic. Thank you for having me. And if you have any questions, I'm always happy to be contacted via email at Sheffield. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was very useful. I found it incredibly useful, and I'm sure the delegates online will have found that as equally useful as well.